Welcome, everyone, to the second annual American Society of International Law Editors-in-Chief Roundtable. We're so thrilled to have you all here. As you can see, this is not the typical ASIL meeting. Instead of having just a panel up at the front of the room, we're joined by all the wonderful editors-in-chief of international law journals from around the country who have signed up to participate in this event. And we're so thrilled to have you all here. This roundtable is meant as an opportunity for you all to have conversations with us, but also with one another. When we hold this in person, part of the goal is to give you guys a chance to get to know each other and to have a chance to interact with one another. Sadly, we don't have as much of an opportunity to do that this time, but we hope to be able to reconvene next year in person. We even had a cocktail party planned this year. Sorry we weren't able to do that this time, but we will next time. And part of the goal here is to think about what are your shared interests, challenges. How do you think about your role as leaders in the international law scholarship community? And to the extent that we can provide some answers to some of the shared questions you all have, we're going to try to do that. But again, our hope is that part of what will happen here is that you all will be able to provide ideas to one another. So let me just begin by saying thank you to Leila Sadat and Sergio Puig, who were key in creating this 2 years ago, who have led the charge in envisioning this project and who have really been crucial to our not only creating the idea initially, planning it for this year, then also switching it to being online. So thank you so much to all of them. And part of the goal here is to think about the role that international law journals play in shaping international scholarship in the United States. So international journals were formed in part because mainstream journals weren't really publishing much in the way of international law. They were publishing a very constrained view of what international law scholarship might be. And so students began to organize in the 70s to create their own journals that would allow them to have a vision of international law, to publish international law, to put scholarship out into the world that would shape the field. As one of the early editors of the precursors of the Yale Journal of International Law put it, that he saw his act of publishing as direct participation in the process of enlightenment. And it is that. You're playing a role in creating the field. You're defining what the field is. You're giving voice to scholars around the country and around the world and to students when you publish student work. And you really are helping to define what the field of international law is. And that's a pretty exciting and wonderful thing. It's also challenging and difficult because when you're working in international law, there's new and different challenges from mainstream journals around language, around culture, and how to reach out to scholars from all around the country. So part of the goal of this is to talk about those special challenges that you face as an international law journal, and to try and give you some thoughts about how you might begin to overcome them and address them. And there's no single right answer to many of these questions. In many ways, it's just thinking about what is the right answer for your journal. How do you want to address these challenges? So a little bit of logistics. We have a wonderful faculty panel, and I'm going to pose a few questions to them to get things started. And then we are going to turn to questions from the editors-in-chief, who are going to use the raise hand function that I know you all are now very familiar with. Through Zoom, you just click on participants and you can raise your hand that way. We'll call on you on order. If you are watching and you're not one of the editors-in-chief showing up on the video, but you have a question, you can use the chat function to pose your question. That will be passed on to me, and then hopefully we'll have time to be able to pose that to the panelists or to the editors-in-chief. So if you're watching and you're not on video here, but you have a question, feel free to send that in as well. Okay, so enough of me. I want to turn it over to our amazing panelists. I'm going to introduce them one at a time and pose a kind of opening question to them just to get things started. So first is Julian Arato, who is professor of law and co-director of the Dennis Block Center for sorry, my notes here are moving on me. For the study of international business law at Brooklyn Law School. His article on the private law critique of international investment law won the 2019 Francis Deak Prize for the best article by a younger author published by American Journal of International Law. And when he was a student at NYU, he was a senior articles editor of the Journal of International Law and Politics. So he has some experience serving in your shoes as well. And the question that I have for you, Julian, is how should journals think about how to solicit relevant pieces of international law scholarship? And how do they select the best topics of relevance to the various audiences for international law journals, which are often quite varied, including scholars as well as practitioners, including people from the US, potentially as well as those abroad. So how should they be thinking about soliciting pieces and creating a kind of good mix of scholarship?
And thank you so much for the very overly kind introduction, and really thank you to everybody for coming to this. It just as a scholar, it means so much to me, and I'm sure to all of us, that you're all so engaged with the process of producing scholarship and that you care enough to try to do it right and do a serious job of it, to come to events about it, right? That means everything to us. So really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. To answer the questions, these are crucial questions, and I think it's helpful maybe to take them in the reverse. The reason is that solicitation of articles, going out there and trying to find articles, is something you should do, but it's not your bread and butter, right? The bread and butter is that you get the sort of fire hydrant exposure to Espresso and really now more Scholastica of just, hundreds and hundreds of articles coming in. And so the question of how to pick the right kinds of articles is relevant to both that and the solicitation question. So let's start there. I think the best advice that I could give you is about what not to do. There are some biases that most student editors, I had them, most student editors kind of slip into very easily. And frankly, peer review editors, everybody slips into these biases. And I would call them a novelty bias, topic biases, which are more obvious, and methodology biases. So the novelty bias is by far the most important one that I can stress. There is a sense among many in scholarship, but especially those new to scholarship, that what we are looking for in the world of international legal scholarship is the new, right? The most important thing you can do is be new. The newer, the better. The novel topic is better. The novel take is better. There has to be some novelty, right? We care about total preemption, but total preemption of an argument is probably kind of rare. The reality is that good scholarship is mostly involved standing on the shoulders of those who came before. And so if you overly prioritize novelty, you kind of, first of all, can miss out on a lot of great work, but you also maybe ignore what's most important, carefully crafting arguments that are not necessarily about the newest topics, but might be about the most important topics and might involve a novel take, right? So just because somebody in an abstract spins an article, this is the first article to ever consider the following 5 things, probably it isn't. And if it is, there's an extra threshold to make sure that they're doing a good job of it, right? So we all try to spin, but don't be spun. Don't totally ignore novelty, but it's not the first and final most important thing. Especially as far as new topics go, you shouldn't necessarily prioritize the newest possible topic that you can find, because one of the things that I know that you're all concerned about is having an impact. Publishing papers that are going to be used, that are going to be read, that are going to be engaged with by other scholars, that are going to be cited by litigators, whatever. And there's a reason that topics linger for a while, right? It's because they're important. Second one, topic bias. So I would really encourage you to give extra attention to the topics that you are least interested in. That's the best way to gut check yourself, right? All of us have the things that we care about and are really interested in, and you're kind of going to have an extra sensibility about what's new, what's novel, or what's good, what's a strong argument there. But there's a tendency to sort of over prioritize the stuff that we know because we're excited about it. It's very natural. So always try to force yourself to look much more closely at the things you don't know much about. You'll usually have an article's editing staff. It's not just going to be you. So hopefully there's a mix of interests, but just always try to gut check yourself. Am I just publishing this because I think it's important because I happen to know about this field? And the third one is methodology bias. I don't know who needs to hear this. Not everybody needs to hear this, but there's among many of us, and I've been guilty of this myself, there's 2 different kinds of opposite biases that happen. One is that you see a methodology you don't understand and you assume it must be really good. The other opposite of bias that happens is you see a methodology that you don't understand, and so you assume it must be bad, right? Those are both to be avoided. Methodological diversity, interdisciplinarity is really valuable in scholarship, but the best way to make sure that you're looking at something important, not just on topic, but also in how the topic is analyzed, is to ask around, right? And so this gets to what I would say about some things that you should do in order to pick really good articles, right? Don't be afraid on any of these issues to ask around. Ask those on your faculty. Don't be afraid to ask folks outside of your faculty. I get emails from student editors from all kinds of schools all the time. And they're not like formal peer review requests. Sometimes you get those, but very often they're just, look, I know you're in this field. Do you think that this is something that's important and worth publishing? Because we're not experts. Yeah, you're students, right? You're growing experts, but there are a lot of people out there who are really invested in these fields and are really happy to send a quick email back and sort of answer a gut check question. So at least speaking for myself, bug us, bug me. We're happy to engage. And don't be afraid to use your gut, right? If you think something's interesting, it's probably interesting, right? And that's often enough. I could go on a lot more, but I want to try to keep it a little bit conversational.
Thank you so much. Super helpful. And I'm sure many of you will have follow-up questions. And so I hope you all will ask them when we get to our Q&A session. A couple of quick logistics notes. One is if you have your video off, we invite you to turn it back on, but don't feel obligated to. But we'd love to see your faces so we know who we're talking to. And Layla Sadat gave a very helpful suggestion in the chat that if you want to rename your yourselves so that we know which journal you're with, that's also super helpful so that everyone can kind of see what journals different folks are coming from, because you all might find that kind of interesting to know about one another. All right, so next we have Professor Freya Baytens, who is on the Faculty of Law at Leiden and Oslo University. She's working on an interdisciplinary research project right now evaluating the legitimacy of international courts and tribunals. She serves on the editorial board of the Leiden Journal of International Law, which is a peer-reviewed journal out of the Netherlands, and the academic review board of the Cambridge Journal of International and Comparative Law, also a peer-reviewed journal out of the UK. So she has a lot of experience abroad. She's a really esteemed scholar. And so one of the questions we know many of you often are thinking about and that we wanted her to address is how to work with authors, including those who have different cultural perspectives and maybe also different kinds of scholarly norms to successfully publish their pieces. So how do you work with someone who's coming from a different scholarly tradition to ensure that they are meeting your own scholarly expectations, but that also you can read their work and understand that it's meeting the scholarly expectations of their field? Oh, and Freya, you need to be unmuted. Let me see if I can do that.
I have muted myself, but
you're good.
This is good.
You're
okay,
good. Yeah.
Right. So first of all, thank you for inviting me for this panel. I'm really thrilled to be here. Perhaps one extra note about my background: I actually started as a student editor on the Columbia Journal for European Law, so I do understand the job that you're up against. I have a couple of ideas that apply to both US journals and other journals. And the first one would be actually starting before you get a piece by an author, be very clear in what you expect from them. Be very clear in what kind of articles, the length of articles. So you may not realize, but US articles are twice as long as articles that you would expect in a European journal. So communicate that to authors. I would say also try to actively reach out for the kinds of pieces that you want to get, that you want to see in your journal. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the Law and Practice of International Courts and Tribunals, and we are looking for someone to write an article on regional courts in Africa and regional courts in Latin America, 2 separate pieces, and we're actively soliciting articles for that. We're not guaranteeing publication, but active soliciting is fine. Once you do get a piece, I would say an editor can act as a mediator or a moderator, not just a messenger, yes or no, but somebody who helps authors along by constructive and encouraging comments. The rejection rate is incredibly high. There are lots of people writing about international law. So at least when you let them down nicely. But also in terms of communicating with authors, I would say be constructive in how you phrase comments. So I actually had a look in reviewers' comments that I recently received. And for example, somebody wrote, "Oh, this is the worst paper I've ever read," or "The author has clearly no background knowledge of this field. Don't send that to authors." I think there should be something like how guidelines for constructive comments. And the first one would be focus on the paper, not on the author. You don't know who the author is. Well, in your case, I know in the US, sometimes you know their name or the CV, but in general, don't focus very much on the paper and the content of the paper, not so much on what you think this person knows or doesn't know. Make comments as specific as possible, saying something like, "Oh, well, sometimes the argument is not well supported," or "There are a number of vague statements in this paper," are not terribly helpful. I'm not saying you should do a sentence by sentence review, but something that somebody can work with. Personally, I actually think that there should be an award for the best reviewer or something, or the best editor. Unfortunately, we can't do that because the process is supposed to be anonymous. But I think there's real skill in really properly reviewing and constructively reviewing a good piece. And something as a side note here is that in my experience, there is, and I know this is a huge generalization, and this is my daughter coming up here. This is a huge, no, go away. A huge overgeneralization, but there is a difference between male and female authors, and particularly female authors from developing countries. And I would hope that at least you're interested in these kinds of pieces. So what I very, very often see, and I have been an editor for 20 years now, if a man gets a certain comment, no matter how harsh, if he doesn't agree, he will just dismiss it and think, well, the reviewer or the editor didn't know what they were talking about. If a woman, and particularly I've recently done a project with a lot of female authors from Africa, if they get a comment, they will think, "Oh my goodness, I have written a horrible piece," and they might retract it. They might never actually revise and resubmit. So that is really horrible. You'll be missing out on good pieces because the authors don't have the kind of self-confidence that you might have been raised with. Some people might say, well, the authors shouldn't be such snowflakes. They shouldn't enter the scholarly arena if this is how they feel. But I think we look for good scholarship, not for self-confident authors. So I think we should really try to facilitate publication. And in addition, sometimes you might, and that is a cultural element, you might have authors who are not native speakers. Again, this will take more effort on your part, but often there are good ideas in people's articles who are not native speakers. So in that case, you might want to put a bit more effort in language polishing. Bear in mind that, for example, if you're looking at non-US authors, there are still a number of universities where people work who are not, the publications have to be in the local language. As an example I always give is that I spent some time at a Max Planck in Heidelberg, which is a fantastic center for international law. At that time, they've changed it, but at that time, you could only write your PhD in German or in Latin, not in English. The same applies to this very day in Italy. If people's research is assessed in Italy for tenure, for example, only the pieces written in Italian will count in most universities. So if you then, and these are good people, right? If you then solicit a piece from these authors, I would say be aware that they've made a special effort to do this, and that very often for them this will not count because it's not in the local language, which English is not everywhere. The lingua franca, or the main language of scholarship. One final comment is that if you would decide not to publish a piece, again, give some explanation for that. It may be that you've just accepted another piece on the very same topic, and that is the reason. And that would be helpful to know for an author. And if you really want to help them, I would say, think about a suitable journal other than your own journal and maybe suggest that. I'll keep it to that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I think it elucidates too one of the challenges, which is that typically student law reviews often reject a piece without providing any feedback whatsoever. And so this is a real challenge, I think, for international authors and people used to a peer review system where they're used to receiving feedback. And so that's another kind of important cultural divide to be aware of. If you simply reject a piece without explanation, when someone has made the effort to apply from outside of the United States, they may never come back to you again. And so thinking about whether you want to actively solicit pieces from people outside of the United States, maybe not promise them publication, but if you do solicit a piece and they do submit something, you may feel like you need to provide more feedback than is often the case. So that, I think, is a really important reminder that our cultural expectations can be quite different in scholarship across the US and other places. So that was great. Thank you so much. We're going to come back to many of these questions. I have lots of follow-on questions, but I'm going to leave it there for the moment and move on to Anupam. Professor Anupam Chander is an expert on the global regulation of new technologies. He teaches at Georgetown Law Center, and he recently published the very successful book, The Electronic Silk Road. Before entering academia, he practiced in New York and Hong Kong with Clary Gottlieb. When he served on the Executive Council of the American Society of International Law, he co-founded the International Law and Technology Interest Group. He graduated from the law school at which I teach, Yale Law School. I don't know if he was on the Yale Journal of International Law. I'll invite him to say something about that. I couldn't find it on his many online bios. But the question I have for you, Anupam, is how can student authors identify relevant international law topics on which to write publishable work of their own? So many people who are work for student journals, they're interested not just in publishing other people's work, but they're interested in potentially producing scholarship as well. And maybe some of them eventually want to become international law scholars or forge a career practice where they're also occasionally writing. What advice do you have for them in terms of figuring out how to kind of find that topic, how to begin to think about producing their own novel scholarship?
Great. And yes, indeed, I had the honor of serving on the Yale Journal of International Law and on WIGIL, and I loved it. And I published the paper that became my book in the Yale Journal of International Law. So that was really meaningful to me. And, it's a paper I remain very proud of. And it was wonderful working with the Yale editors. I worked with a number of Yale editors, and the International Law Journal was fantastic, certainly, and made my paper a lot better. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about suggestions for how you might find a topic. Topic selection is, I don't know what percentage of the battle, but it's a very significant percentage. Finding a great topic means that you're really going to contribute something that people need to hear at that moment. And so that's a very difficult challenge because, hey, how do you know what's new in this area? You're a 2L, or just started your third year. That's very hard to say, right? There's in international law, literally hundreds of years of scholarship behind you. So what I typically tend to advise my students is to kind of take the easy route in this context. And that's not the only route, but I'll tell you what the easy route is. The easy route is to talk about something new. Julian began with the novelty bias. That bias exists, and you are writing in the context of the novelty bias that Julian has identified. He's suggested ways that we might be more open, but that is a important thing. It's hard for a 2L or a 3L to rethink conflicts. It's much easier to say, here is a conflict that's happening. Let's talk about this conflict. And maybe that causes us to think about what we've learned before and see whether or not that's still fit to task, right? So use the new challenges, new issues, new world events to really guide you, because it's a way to frame your project so that when you are dealing with editors like yourself across the country, they are more receptive, right? And it also kind of makes more sense. It's hard to imagine the 2L, rewriting, contracts theory, international treaty making powers, etc. I think that happens, and I think you guys are amazing and you are capable. But I'm just talking about the easy way of making your way through this. There are the super ambitious among you, and I do not want to at all squelch your ambition. Rewrite all the stories, etc. Say sovereign equality makes no sense; it's nonsensical. Sovereign immunity makes no sense, etc., etc. Whatever it is you want to do, the nation-state system is terrible. But the easier route, okay, so I'm just being very practical here, is to recognize what's new. Okay, so let me just give you a couple suggestions quickly in that regard. So follow newspapers, blogs, Twitter in the particular area that you're interested in. Read ASIL Insights. So particular sources might be the Financial Times, Ecolex for environmental law, Ref World for human rights, and in my neck of the woods, which is kind of digital issues, global digital issues, the Internet and Jurisdiction Network, which does a fantastic job out of Paris, summarizing these kinds of concerns across the world. Second, of course, you're going to look at SSRN. That's a starting point for my research. Google SSRN. Do site-specific searches on SSRN using Google and not their internal search engine. And I got a suggestion via Twitter from a student named Federico Winter, and I wanted to credit him. So when I asked this question of what I should tell you guys on Twitter, the suggestion I got was look at the dockets of international tribunals. Whether it's the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea Tribunal or the International Criminal Court, look at their dockets. These tribunals tend to be very slow. The issue will be kicking around for a while. And if you write something, it might actually get cited by that tribunal in the process, of the decision-making. Two last suggestions: talk to your law librarian. My first thing that I did when I was tasked with this question was emailed my law librarian and asked her, what should I say? And so she gave me great suggestions, right? And your law librarian was an incredibly helpful resource. And finally, and I think, Julian suggested this also at the start, talk to your law professors. Say, here's what I'm interested in. Is there something that you suggest in this area? And half the time they're going to say, I can't think of anything, which is fine. But what happens, and what happens with me is I can't think of anything right now, but you put a bug in my ear, and when I get when I run across something, I was like, oh, let me just email Margot with this great idea that might be actually relevant, right? So talk to all these people. I think you're going to make. I think there was this important point about making the scholarly world, and your contributions are super valuable. And good luck.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anupam. I will filibuster for a minute by adding a couple additional ideas there, but I'm going to invite you all now to raise your hands if you have your own questions, and I hope that you will. A couple things I would just add to what Anupam said, and I thought all of that advice was excellent. One is keep notes during class about things that you find confusing, because sometimes you find something confusing not because you're not understanding it, but because there's something incoherent in the law. There's a lot of that in international law. And it's also a good set of notes you can then go to talk to your professor in office hours about. And if they don't have a good explanation for why that actually does make sense, it might be a good start to an article. And I also would add, think about what your value add might be. Say you speak Russian, like maybe you can read all these Russian sources on a particular topic and bring that insight into scholarship. Maybe you have a background in tech that gives you a way of looking at some problems that the cyber law world has been facing, but nobody who's writing in the area understands the tech well enough to be able to describe it well. So think about what background or experience you might have that allow you to say something that not everybody is able to say. So I did a good job of filibustering because we have a couple of hands. That's great. So Samantha Franks, please let us know what question you have. And you're welcome to direct a question to a particular person or just ask your question and then we'll figure out who might be the best person to answer it.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you, for presenting. This is really cool. And thank you for making sure that it happened when it went online still.
Thank you.
So I'm with the Michigan Journal of International Law, and one thing that we've been thinking about a lot in the last couple of weeks particularly is how we can amplify marginalized voices within the law. And one of those is obviously third world approaches to international law, and one easy way is to solicit articles on that topic. But I was wondering if you guys had any other thoughts about how we can try and ensure that we're getting voices that are often overlooked in traditional international law spaces, and to encourage our own students to do that research.
Can I jump in just because it lets me also talk about something I was supposed to talk about, which is soliciting. I think it dovetails really, really well. I mean, I think it's Samantha, an absolutely admirable goal and something to pursue really vigorously. And there's a few different ways to go about solicitation, right? One thing you could try to do is sort of when you see something posted on SSRN, everybody I recommend follow International Law Reporter. It's a website that just posts new things coming out in international law. Most of the time, they're things that are already published, but it gives you a good idea about what the newest articles are. It's very, very, very helpful. Jacob Katz-Kogan runs it, International Law Reporter. So sometimes you'll see like a new article on SSRN published there. That's not actually published in a journal. It's a fully formed article. It's not placed somewhere. You could try to solicit that. That sort of thing is rare. I think the much more valuable path towards solicitation of pieces is to look at blogs, to look at lots of different kinds of blogs and sort of see what somebody is just trying out a new idea about. And you could then email the author and say, this is really great. Do you want to develop this into an article? And you know, you get an edge with publication. You know, we're offering you to publish an article on this topic. You know, so that leads to your question. I think that might be a way to enhance relationships with marginalized communities as well, because you're sort of reaching out directly to somebody who has proven that they've got an interesting idea, right? It's not just randomly finding somebody, but who might not have thought they want to develop an article on a topic, or might not have thought it was going to be successful, might not have had the opportunity to get the kind of feedback that some of us get. So a great example of one of those blogs would be the Afronomics blog, just because we've heard the wonderful lecture by James Gottke yesterday. But there's lots of other blogs, and it doesn't have to be a specialist blog. Your blog of the European Journal of International Law, it's not a funnel to the European Journal of International Law. You can poach pieces from them, and lots of other blogs. So the blogs, just get a collection, get a feed, and that's a way to start doing this. The other side of that, and I know just one sentence, is go to things, right? Your students, that doesn't mean you're not part of the international law community now. Go to symposia, go to conferences, especially in this COVID era. They're all virtual and a lot of them are free. And if you think someone has something interesting to say, ask them if they want to publish on that, or just start a relationship, right? I mean, you know, you can sort of solicit them to publish something. It can be a book review, case note, shorter essay, whatever it is.
I think that is all fantastic advice, Julian. And if you've looked at James Gottke's piece, so he gave the Grotius lecture for American Society of International Law yesterday, and there's a piece that is associated with that he's posted on SSRN. If you're on Twitter, I tweeted it out yesterday, so you can grab it there, but you can also just Google his name or search for it on SSRN. And at the bottom of it, he has a long bibliography of scholars in TWAIL. And it might be, if you're thinking about soliciting, that's not a bad guide to people who are already writing a lot in this field. And he's got maybe 20 pages of work listed there. So really fantastic. And I think, you know, all of us have to be thinking about how to be more open-minded. And what I love about your question is that it connects to what I understand was part of what led to the formation of international law journals in the beginning, was this goal of having different perspectives being shown in scholarship than the mainline journals were showing. And so this is a really important role that international law journals can play, and a key corrective to our history in international law. I think every field has a reckoning to do. International law maybe more so than any other, or at least as much as any other. And so I'm glad you're really interested in thinking that through. That's great. Next is Roberta from the Harvard International Law Journal.
Hi. I first just want to thank ASIL and everyone who was involved in organizing this for the opportunity to be here and with such wonderful people. I'm really excited, and it's great to hear from others and learn from your experiences. So the questions, I have a whole host of questions, but I'll try to limit it to a few. So very much in the spirit of what Samantha just raised, we're also trying to think about, how we can solicit more widely. So that means, obviously within the US, but also beyond the US. And in particular, I mean, if we look at the submissions that we receive, as much as we try to, sort of look into scholars from a diverse range of areas, in the end, the vast majority of pieces that we receive are still from US trained lawyers or lawyers based in the US. So really, just a question of how can we actually reach people outside of that. The second question, and something we've been working on, is more particular, sort of related to women in international law and how we can support them. So support both student female lawyers who are interested in the field, and also scholars. So we're hoping to kind of set up a women's initiative with the journal, and I would love to hear, any ideas and input that you would have for that. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I might ask Freya if she has a thought, because you've anticipated actually one of the questions I wanted to pose to Freya as well, which is, how do you reach out of the United States to scholars outside? And I think one of the divides, or one of the difficulties, and I don't know that this is Super Bowl, but maybe you have thoughts about this, is that we are strange in the US in that our journals are student run and not peer reviewed. And that does create an issue for many people who are abroad, where non-peer reviewed articles may not count towards tenure or other expectations. And so it may mean that if you're going to reach some of these people, and Freya, interested in your thoughts about this, do you need to look for more non-traditional opportunities to write, maybe shorter pieces that aren't going to take someone a really long time, maybe other kinds of writing opportunities where somebody doesn't have to spend an article that they need for their tenure, but you still get their voice in the journal. So are there other ways that we can be creative to work around that? And I think also your point, Roberta, about making sure that we're thinking about diversity in all its forms, including gender. So that's a real challenge, and it has traditionally been a big challenge in international law, especially. So Freya, I don't know if you want to start us off, and then if others want to jump in, you should feel free.
Yeah, so I think you anticipated half of my answer, and that in order to be taken into account for tenure, in order to be taken into account for a promotion, or just to be taken into account in what you have to do every year, you need to publish in peer-reviewed journals. And student journals are eyed with suspicion, even if the name of a very well-known university is attached to it. The idea is, how can students know what is good scholarship? Which I admit is an arrogant view, but it is the general view. So what can you do about this? I don't know to what extent it would be difficult for you to install some measure of peer review. I think that it's easier than you might think. I think a lot of professors spend time peer reviewing, so they would definitely also peer review for you. I think also that sometimes getting a peer review from a person who's, for example, working in the same field or who is from the same region might actually get you really good comments on that particular piece as well. So if it is in any way possible to install peer review, I think that would make you much more interesting, forum to publish in. You should also be aware that many European universities have a kind of a point system, where you have, for a publication in, for example, the American journal, you get 2 points. For a publication in a still well-known but lesser-known journal, say the Journal of International Dispute Settlement, you get 1 point. These examples that I'm giving are actually in my own university. If you're on neither of these lists, no points, again, that will make it very unattractive for people to publish. And you can say, well, you can then write shorter pieces or accept shorter pieces, but mostly people are quite busy with teaching or combining practice with teaching, so they don't really have many pieces to spare. And as a journal, is that really sort of the ones that are not good enough for a peer-reviewed journal? Are that the ones that you want to receive? I would assume not. So if at all, you can install a system with peer review, and if at all, you can sort of look in different countries, sort of what are these lists? They're very similar, right? I mean, it's not, there's a hugely different list for the Netherlands and for Norway. And you can you just spend some time investigating how you get on these lists. Sometimes the only thing you have to do is send a request, or have a professor in that system send the request. And that will immediately put you on the radar of a lot more people. I think the worst thing, and what really scares off people outside of the US, is the reputation that US journals have, perhaps undeservedly. I'm ready to accept that, but that you choose based on CV, based on who you know, based on who's a famous professor. I think that's not true. But that is the reputation. So if in some way you can, maybe just on your website, make that clear, or when you write a call for papers, make that clear. Even if you don't have a blind peer review system, that at least the people who do know who the authors are will not be doing that based on, okay, does this person have a chair already? I think that would help. And I think if you want to get more pieces from outside the US, try to get non-US students on your editorial board. Most of you will have a very extensive, most of your universities will have a very extensive LLM program. So if you try to get some editors from the LLM group, I think that would give you a better idea of what's around. And then maybe one final element. I know there may be pieces that are not immediate, where the usefulness is not immediately obvious for somebody in the US system. You know, why would you care what happens with international developments in Europe or in Asia? But I think if you find a good balance of things that are immediately useful and that all students would read because it's relevant for their international law course, and things that are maybe a bit more, long-term, a bit more interesting, maybe a bit more niche, I think that will also give people the idea that US journals are more accessible than they previously thought.
One thing I might just add to that is Freya just referenced the idea of editorial boards. I will hazard the guess that not all of you have editorial boards. If you do, it may be an opportunity to diversify your range of input by inviting people from outside of the United States to serve on your editorial board, because they could provide you advice and assistance for thinking about how to reach scholars outside the United States, or as was asked earlier, trail scholars and the like. You might see maybe somebody on that bibliography from James's list, might invite them to serve on your editorial board. If you don't have an editorial board, you might think about forming an editorial board and including people like that on it. You want to be clear about what you're expecting out of them, whether you're asking them to serve in a peer reviewing function or whether you're just simply asking them to provide advice of the kind you're receiving now. But that can be quite useful. I know the Yale Law Journal has one. YJIL's is much more informal. And I think that can be a good way of seeking advice. You can be very clear about the role that they play, but that might be one way of getting more input about how to do a better job reaching outside of the United States if you don't already have someone from outside the United States on your editorial boards. Nima Hakim from the Chicago Journal of International Law, you're next.
Hi, first, thank you so much. Just to echo what some of the others have said, this is super helpful. To hear what works, what doesn't work. So I guess before I have just a question that I'll try to condense it to one question instead of two. But first, one anxiety or frustration that our journals experienced, and I'm not sure if some of the other journals have experienced it as well, is a uniformity of citation. So usually we have, our blue book, which provides the foundation, and then we have a style sheet that has gloss that's useful to basically gap fill in areas where the blue book may not be sufficient for our purposes. And I flag that as sort of a pervasive concern and something that our journal wants to, to the extent there's others on this call that want to work with our journal on trying to develop more collaboration and uniformity so that there's some matching of our style sheets, that would be excellent. So turning to the question that's somewhat related, I'm curious to hear about, once an article has been accepted and you're a scholar, what are your expectations with respect to the communications you receive from the journal? And I say that as do you just want to receive, the edits? Would you like to, by the time we accept the piece, for example, we have months before we're going to start going into our more, our editorial schedule that's really just week by week by week by week. And it's hard to then have much flexibility once that gets started, once we're on the road to publication. I'd love to hear just a little bit about the process of communication that's just helpful, from emails to calls, and what you think works well, what you think doesn't. Because I think some students, when we're emailing professors, are sensitive to not wanting to waste your time and also being sensitive to you're probably busy. So just hearing about those dynamics would be great. And then a small subset I just really want to add to that, because it does influence our ability to judge international law scholarship from others outside the United States, which we definitely review and take seriously. One difficulty we have is sometimes the footnotes will be completely out of compliance with our Blue Book. And so the issue there is, if we take the piece, which we think is great scholarship, we might not take it because it's just out of compliance. And so I'd be curious about, with respect to communicating to scholars, if that's ever an okay ask to say, would you mind putting all of your Blue Books or taking an initial pass? Or do you have a research assistant who can help you put these into Blue Book compliance? If not, we might still be able to do it. But it's hard to have that conversation before you extend an offer of acceptance. So I know this is sort of like a ramble to some extent, but I'd be curious to hear your response to that issue of just communications generally, and then also whether asking for compliance with a particular editorial standard is appropriate pre-offer or even after offer. Thanks.
This is great. And I might ask Anupam to take a shot at this. I have my own opinions, but I will try to step back.
Sure. So can you ask a foreign author to convert all of his or her citations to Blue Book? I think the answer is no. You certainly can, and the person will try, but I think it makes much more sense for student editors to just do it themselves. If you want the piece, just do the work. And that's what you guys are expert at, and it'll be much easier for you to do it. It just makes sense. With respect to, I wanted to just make a couple comments on some of the earlier questions as well. With respect to the question of, more diversity, et cetera, and, more voices. So I think it's important for this to occur in the symposium planning process. That's the main route for solicitation, right? When law journals solicit, it's for a symposium. That's the traditional route. In that context, it's important to work with faculty members, because faculty members are very good at this. But one thing faculty members, and a lot of faculty members, are not good at is thinking about diversity. And I think, make sure it's gender balanced, make sure it's diverse, in getting diverse voices. And so faculty members push their friends, and their friends will often look just like them. And the faculty, we already know that, so it just replicates itself. So symposia, I think, are like one of the great representations of white supremacy in this country. And so that's where you need to focus on, okay? So second, I wanted to caution about TWAIL as well. I want to just point out that TWAIL is not equal to other voices. TWAIL is a particular approach to thinking about international law, right? So it's David Kennedy, B.S. Chimney, et cetera, right? So there's a particular school of that is TWAIL. It should not be equated to scholars from the Global South, right? So I think you want to be just a little bit cautious about that. And the final thing I want to say is, I'm not so, it's not clear to me that there's a particular value in American journals publishing voices from New Zealand or Australia or even Europe. And so they have plenty of places to publish. There's no dearth of Australian law journals, et cetera. So I think, if you're going to be going out and reaching out and soliciting pieces, I think it's actually much more important to think about who needs the amplification. So I'll leave it at that.
That is fantastic, and I think some really important points, Anupam. Did you get an answer to your question? I had to jump away for 1 second because my doorbell was ringing. Did you get an answer to your question about the communication standards? Has that been adequately answered?
Can I just touch on the communications, because the one part of it, I think I could add something on. So what the part that I think we didn't address was the what do you expect as a scholar from communication from the journal? And I would say a couple of things. One is there's this sort of bias out there among American authors, but also European authors and authors everywhere in the world, that American law students are going to kill you, right? With just edits after edits after edits, making you do all kinds of stuff. Actually, the reality is that American law students do a lot of your work for you. So it's not that they kill you. So it's actually a good thing. But you see the paper come back to you, and it looks like there's just someone spilled Skittles over every page. There's so much redlining from so many different authors. It looks nightmarish. So I think you can try to fight that, and I think there's a huge advantage in trying to fight that. So one thing is, me personally, I don't think that that's super necessary for you to be doing, right? I mean, authors need to cite the right things, and they need to not plagiarize and lie in their footnotes. And if they do that, it reflects poorly on them. It doesn't reflect poorly on the journal. No one will say the Chicago Journal of International Law published a plagiarist. How could they do that? They're burned forever. No, that author will be burned forever. I mean, extreme plagiarism, obviously, look out for. I'm being a little bit excessive here. But I don't know that you guys need to do the extent of in-depth work that you sometimes do. But if you're going to do it, as Anupam suggested, that's fine. You're doing the work. You're not making the author do that. So you're like, don't send back billions of queries to the author, making them do it if it's easier for you to just do something yourself anyway. But what I was going to sort of say is you can also shift this to the solicitation side, right? One thing, I think it was the William and Mary Law Review, but it really impressed me. What they did was, when they accepted a piece of mine, they said, and we want you to know that we are a light touch journal. We care about authorial voice. It's not our job to write the article. It's your job, and it's your article. And we're here to make it it's not about necessarily compliance. It's about making sure that, it fits our format. To the extent that there's formatting things, we will do that. And we'll have queries and we'll have editorial suggestions, but it's not going to be demands. It's going to be suggestions. And then when the communication started, it wasn't that they just sent me billions of track change line edits of every single thing, or actually changing chunks of text in my article and asking if that was okay. They would send an authored letter that sort of said, here are some suggestions that we have. Here's some things that you could do. For minor stuff, we might sort of do editorial suggestions down the line, but we're not going to just move huge chunks of your paper. That actually will help make people want to publish with your journal. If you tell them right away, we're a light touch journal, we value authorial voice, that is a reason to publish with us. You're ahead of the game. I know it means a whole lot to me when I see that in a letter.
I completely agree. If I'm choosing between two journals and one tells me they're a light edit journal and the other tells me they otherwise, I go with the light edit journal every time. I think the main thing I would add to that is just remember, authors have to sound like themselves. You don't want to turn everybody into some corporate voice. And if people, phrase it a little bit differently than you would phrase it, but it's not grammatically incorrect, resist the urge to change it. And I think the main thing with communication with authors is just being really clear. I really appreciate it when a journal gives me a schedule up front and says, here's what's going to happen. And then they actually meet the deadlines that they say they're going to meet. That is really helpful to me because I'm managing several other pieces of work at the same time. And I know, okay, I'm going to get this back at this date. And then if they write me the day before and tell me, oh, it's actually going to be another month, that's a problem for me because I've scheduled time to work on the article when I was expecting to get it back. So I would just say, be clear about your expectations, be good, a good, ordinary professional skills of being clear about what you're expecting and then meeting the deadlines that you've set for yourself. So Devin Berkstein from the Berkeley Journal of International has a question.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for setting this up. We've been having some internal communications around sort of the wisdom of doing themed issues, considering that the history of international law journals is, especially derived from the fact that this category was excluded. So it seems, especially inept most of the time to have a themed issue within it. We are actually doing a themed issue on on refugee law and migration issues. By the way, any students who would like to submit a student note, we are still looking for a student note. So please spread that far and wide. But yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the wisdom of doing themed issues, since we're already sort of a themed journal, or our category journal is themed.
That's great. I'll add one very quick thing and then see if the others want to jump in. I mean, I think that actually, particularly if there's an area you think is under-attended to in scholarship, having a theme is a fantastic way of bringing attention to that field and highlighting to people that that's something that you want to bring focus to. And it can also make it kind of the go-to place for people to look for a set of materials on an area that's undercovered. And I think refugee law, is obviously incredibly timely. And it can be a way of doing an outreach too, because you can let people know we're doing this issue on refugee law, make sure that that's known outside the United States as well as best you can. I think that there's a theme issue question, and then there's solicited symposia, which are not necessarily the same thing, although sometimes they're treated as the same thing. I have some of the worries that Anupam does about solicited symposia. I also, having run a symposia when I was an editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal, I can tell you it's so much work. In part because the work often comes in much rawer than the material that you're used to dealing with. So you just have to plan more time to work through the material, because you have solicited somebody wonderful to write something for your issue, but you don't know what you're going to get back. And if you've promised them publication, it may not be the very, very best, because they know it's going to be published regardless, unless it's really terrible. So that's a cautionary note. But I think, I've been thinking about sort of the history of racism in international law as a great topic. There's been more attention to that recently. So thinking about issues that we haven't really explored in the past that could be focused on, in my mind, seems like a great idea. I don't know if others have something to add, and we have 4 minutes left. And I see that there's great comments going on in the chat, encouraging you all to share your email. So letting Justine know, she gave her email in the chat. If you are comfortable having your email address shared with the other editors who are on this call, if you are, that will put you all in touch with one another, and you can follow up on some of the things that you all seem interested in sharing views about, such as coming up with a shared style sheet, which I think is a great idea. The Blue Book was just revised. The next time it's revised would be an opportunity for you all to get, if you come up with a shared style sheet, you could get it introduced into the Blue Book next time around. So starting work on that now is a great idea. And so hopefully that will give you guys a chance to carry on the conversation. So maybe I'll open it up to last comments from my panelists. We have 3 minutes, so like 30 seconds apiece. If you have any parting wisdom for our student editors, and maybe we'll go in the same order that we started. So Julian, do you want to start?
Yeah, one thing we didn't touch on when we're talking about attracting articles is bells and whistles, and how to sort of win the fight of how to get an article which you really like, and also soliciting articles. And I would just really suggest that this is a good path, but you have to be careful about what bells and whistles you choose. Some useful things are, if you really love an article or really want to publish an article by somebody, do a symposium around the article and have response pieces that are shorter, because fancy people might have no problem writing, a couple thousand words to make a friend of theirs feel really happy, right? So it's not always about getting a whole issue full of articles. If you get one really great article and then a bunch of response papers, that's really valuable. The other thing is you can attach that to a lecture, right? If the school is willing to fund that sort of thing, some are, some aren't. Invite somebody to give a lecture and publish the lecture, and then they don't have to do duplicative work. Those bells and whistles matter. Having a few online comments might be valuable, but might not matter as much to somebody. So, really think about what would somebody want and what might attract them. A prize is another way to do it, or even a peer review prize. I think the NYU Journal did that a long time ago, that one piece a year would be judged by the peers. So there's lots of different ways to do it, but bells and whistles can help. And let me just also say, really again, thank you so much for doing this. And I love what I'm seeing in the chat. It's pretty inspiring. So thanks a lot.
Great. Freya, parting 30 seconds of thought. Oh, she's frozen for me at least. So Anupam, we'll go to you. Sure. I want to echo Julian's observation that you guys are doing amazing work. It's often unsung, you're laboring late in the night, getting those edits out. It's incredible work, and you're double checking and triple checking and quadruple checking to make sure it's all right, and you're making us look smart. So thank you so much for what you do. It's incredible. I'll just leave it at that. And let me just close by saying, I hope that we can put you all in touch with one another. So if you haven't sent your email to Justine, please do that. That I think would be really important for keeping you all in touch with one another. A big part of our goal with this was to create a community of people who are interested in international law scholarship, who are young, who are the future of the field, and that's you. And so you have a lot of shared interest, and hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation among you, not the end of it. And we hope that we can bring you all back, or your successors back in person next year, so that we can enjoy actually meeting in person and having that drink. But in the meantime, we hope you guys are able to carry on the conversation. Thank you for all you do. Thank you to my wonderful panelists for their participation. And again, to ASIL for supporting this. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful summer, and we look forward to seeing you in the future at many ASIL events. Take care.